Hello and welcome to this session on an introduction to project management. My name is Josh Burton and I want to talk you through some of the tools and techniques used by project managers. Now, project management is a huge subject. It covers a whole range of disciplines and project managers typically can make a whole career out of running lots of different projects over a period of time. Some projects can be short-term projects, often taking several weeks or months to include, like the implementation of a new IT system or something similar to that. And then there's large-scale projects which can span many years and cost millions of pounds. If you look at projects like Crossrail and HS2, these are huge projects. But the tools and principles used by project managers are very standardised now. There are a number of different methodologies, but they tend to use a similar sort of tools. So I want to talk you through those. And before I do, I think it's important also to talk about there are four main stages to managing most projects. And we can look at those in a bit more detail during the session, but as an introduction to those, they're the four stages. So stage number one is usually called initiate, and this is where the project requirements are clarified, so the objectives or outcomes are organised and sorted out, and the people that are going to be involved, the key stakeholders, will be identified, and typically the scope of the project will be clarified as well, so what's going to be included in this project and also what's excluded. So that will be clarified during the initiation phase, and typically that will need to be cleared before you then go on to stage two, which is the planning stage. Now, planning is when we start to get a bit more organised and structured about the activity. So the key stakeholders will be brought together, usually for a kick-off meeting. They will then agree exactly who has which responsibilities, and we'll talk about some of the tools used for those as well. And then a schedule will be drawn up, a timeline with various milestones included in that to take the project right the way through to its completion. So that's the planning phase. And then no work usually can start until the planning has been signed off. So there's a sign-off period for the initiation stage, there's a sign-off period at the end of the planning stage. And then the third part of this is the execute and control stage, which is then about implementing the changes required by the project and monitoring those and reviewing them on a regular basis. So project managers typically have an implementation role that monitors and checks throughout that phase. And then when that implementation is completed, again, there'll be a kind of sign-off phase, which is called the closing, and that's the fourth stage of the project, which is to close the project down. Typically, this involves, again, reviewing all that's happened during the project stage and then looking at the lessons learnt from that and handing over the changes, whether that's a new extension to a railway station or an airport extension, or like Crossrail, where you've built a whole new set of stations and lines for transport. That will be then handed over to business as usual. So make sure that the project is closed down and now the new way of working is embedded in. So those are the four key stages of project management. And in my experience, project managers that are very good at starting projects aren't always as good at closing them, and vice versa. So the really professional project managers who have been doing this for many years build up a skill set that covers all four, from starting projects off, making sure they get delivered, to closing them off. Right, so some of the tools that project managers use. I want to talk about 5 different tools that project managers use. The first one is the SWOT analysis. Now, some of you may have come across this before. SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. There's an important distinction to make. The first two, strengths and weaknesses, are usually internal to the organisation or team that's involved in delivering the change. And the opportunities and threats are external factors. So what's happening in the wider world or in that market or industry at the moment that may have an impact on the project. So the idea of doing a SWOT analysis is to do this very early on, usually at the initiation phase, to identify what strengths have we got within the team, what are the weaknesses, but also to look at what opportunities and threats are external to the project that might have an impact on its effectiveness. So SWOT's done at the initiation phase. The downside with SWOTs, in my experience, is that they don't have, or often don't have, any measurables or quantifiables involved. They're done at a very high level. So there's another tool we're going to talk about in a minute that will help to balance that out a little bit. The second tool I want to talk about is called a RAID log. Now, RAID stands for risks, assumptions, issues and dependencies. So when we're identifying those opportunities and threats, we need to break them down a little bit more into a bit more detail. Risks are things which have the potential to happen but haven't happened yet, and we need to grade those, give them a bit of a scoring mechanism as to whether we think they're a high risk, medium or low, and then also to grade the likelihood that that risk may occur. So something may have a high threat to the project, but the likelihood of it happening could be very remote. So one might offset the other. Then we've also got the assumptions, that's the A part of RAID. Assumptions are things that we can't confirm at this stage when we're scoping out the project, but it's something that we need to factor in and might be able to confirm as we go through the planning phase. Then issues are real things that we know are going to happen and that we need to account for in our planning. And the fourth part, the D, is dependencies. Dependencies are things that can only happen when something else has happened. So when we're going to put together our list of tasks that are required for the project to be successful, we need to identify which task can only happen when something else has been done first, and then which of those are dependent on which. So you get a chain of dependencies, and this will affect our thinking when it comes to things like the Gantt chart and critical path analysis. Okay, so that's the second tool, a RAID log. The third one I want to talk about is force field analysis. Force field analysis, simply put, is kind of weighing up the pros and the cons. What's for the project succeeding and what's against it, what could potentially block the project's effectiveness. And the idea is to list all of the fors and the againsts, but then to give them some kind of measurables. So put in this for, maybe there's something opposing the, something in favour of the task, like sign off from a senior authority. That will have a higher weighting than maybe something on the against side that has a lower relevance. So they might have a slight hiccup in trying to introduce this in a particular department, but we know that the for has a higher quantifiable or measurable value to it. So we go through all of our fors, give them measures, we go through all of our againsts, give those measures too, then add them up at the bottom and work out really, can we put a case together to say this project is going to be successful, or actually when we've weighed up the pros and cons, I don't think we're going to struggle to get this through, so we need to kind of analyse that. So that's what the force field analysis does, weighs up the pros and cons and gives them some measurables. Then usually at the planning stage as well, we then do the next thing, number 4 on our list, which is the RACI log. RACI stands for responsible, accountable, consulted and informed. And this is the level of commitment that the various stakeholders may have on the project. So responsible is somebody given a task to do within the team. Accountable is the person ultimately who has ownership of that and who will carry the ultimate authority for it, essentially. So these are usually fairly senior project sponsors who it's in their interest to make sure the project is delivered. Consulted, these are people who are affected by the project or who have expertise or input to the project. So often we have subject matter experts who are involved, and we need to make sure that they're consulted at the right stages in the project plan. And then the fourth one, RACI I, is informed. So these are people often who may be affected by the project but might not have any input to it. So people who, through the implementation of the changes that are involved, are going to be impacted by that. We need to make sure that information goes out to those people on a fairly regular or consistent basis, or at key milestones in the implementation of the project. So we've got responsible, accountable, consulted and informed. And this will help us to put together in the planning stage a grid with the people's names and whether they are R, A, C or I. And this keeps the ownership in the right places throughout the project. So it avoids some of the confusion around, I thought he was doing that or she was doing that, and making sure that we've clarified that ownership early on in the planning stage. The last tool that I want to talk about, again, is an essential part of planning. So after the initiation is done and the scoping, we get the right people together and do the planning stage, and they're called Gantt charts. What's really useful about Gantt charts is that they show a timeline from start all the way through the project to its finish. And they list the key tasks that must happen, usually down the one side, with the timeline across the top, so the weeks and months for the project to roll out. And it shows how the different tasks listed vertically are then linked together horizontally through the chart. I think these are really useful to use, and we're going to have a go at doing one of those during the training session. Gantt charts help to identify what's called the critical path of the project. That is the longest time it will take if everything's done on time through. It also shows where the dependencies lie, which we talked about earlier from the RAID log. And what they do is then show us where there's any float in the delivery or implementation of tasks. So sometimes we can have tasks that's got a lot of float. It doesn't matter if we start them early or late and they can still be done. But there are some tasks, those that are on the critical path, where if any of those slip or are delayed for any reason, that will push the timeline out and they won't be completed by the required date. So the Gantt chart is essential to project managers keeping an overview of where they are with the project, and it also helps other people that are affected by the project, like those that need to be informed or consulted, where those impact points are throughout the course of the project. So Gantt charts, very useful. Then there are some other documents that you should be aware of that can be used. We're not going to go into too much detail on the training session that we cover, simply just because of lack of time. But there's something you need to be aware of. So one is called the project charter. The charter is usually done right at the start by the project sponsor, saying why they believe this change is necessary. So the project charter spells out the purpose behind the project and why it's so important. There's another document called a comms plan, where again, depending on time on the day, we might have a little look at this. But a comms plan, again, identifies those people that are responsible, accountable, consulted and informed, and spells out a timetable when they need to be communicated with. And not only the timetable, but what is the appropriate method and what's the appropriate message. So it's the timing, the message and the method of delivery, whether that's an email, whether it's a phone call or a Skype, or whether indeed we need to actually sit down with these people face to face and make sure that their involvement is secure. Two other documents we need to talk about. There's the change request log. So during the rollout of a project, quite often there'll be things that have come out of scope. And this could be the stakeholders, this could be the ultimate client or end users for the change that's required. And they might come along halfway through and say, actually, we need to include this in the project. Now, project managers constantly have to weigh up any changes that come across and the impact they could have on the project. Could it increase the budget? Could it push out the timescale? Does it mean we need extra resources involved? So a change request log should be kept by the project manager throughout the course of the project and is continually updated and checked. Often they will go back to the project sponsor and make sure that the project sponsor is happy with those changes, or do we need to control them and manage them more effectively. And the last document I want to talk about is the sign-off or closure document. Typically when a project is completed and all the implementation is done, some kind of review is required. This is essential to make sure that, first of all, were the initial objectives met when we come to the sign-off, or to what extent have they been met? Also, what lessons were learnt through the project. Now, this is something that often gets overlooked, and I think it's a shame. If projects overrun or the money's run out, this can get overlooked, and then what can tend to happen is if lessons aren't learnt, if those aren't recorded and identified and built on for the future, we end up repeating the same errors, and that's problematic. So a good project manager will spend time evaluating the success of the project through its duration, but then also needs to look at some kind of handover. So part of the project closure will be a handover document to the people that will then be using the new way of working on a more regular basis, whether it's a new train station, whether it's an extension to an airport, or whether it's simply a new IT system embedded into an organisation, to make sure the users of that are going to be happy with it and know what it is they're doing. So they're the main things I wanted to cover in this introductory talk. A little bit about the 4 stages: initiate, plan, execute, control and close. The 5 types of tools that we need to look at in some detail, so that's SWOT, RAID, force field analysis, the RACI log and the Gantt charts, and then the additional documents that may or may not come up during the course of your involvement with this. So like I said at the start, project management is a huge subject, and a lot of people make very good careers out of just being project managers. I think for our needs, there are some valuable tools there that any manager can find useful in their work. So I'm looking forward to seeing you at the session on project management, the introduction to project management, as part of your programme, and I look forward to seeing you then. All the best.